we've engaged with these decision makers for like quite a period of time, and if we all want to make like a sound for how that's made us feel, just like just like we've got all this like energy and all this like enthusiasm to try and make tangible changes, and this is what we're dealing with, which is why we're here doing this podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Fossil Free Now, a podcast created by Fossil Free Glasgow. Fossil Free Glasgow are campaigning for the Strathclyde Pension Fund to remove their investments from the fossil fuel industry. As of October 2018, they still haven't. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the campaign, why it's important to us, and what we're going to be talking about in the future.
I'm Zsara, I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm facilitating this discussion.
I'm Louise, and I use the pronouns she, her.
I'm Dan, and I use the pronouns he, him, or they, them.
I'm Mathieu, and I go by he.
I'm Scott, and I go by he, him.
Cathal, he, him.
I'm Lisa, and I use the pronouns she, her.
Yeah, so the first kind of question is everyone getting a chance to present themselves and what brought them into the campaign. I think it's really great that we've got the different perspectives. You were there from the beginning, Matthew, so maybe you want to set the scene.
Okay. I joined this campaign right when I arrived to Glasgow, so I came here to do a PhD on climate change, and because I felt that you wouldn't actually change anything to the situation of climate change by just doing research on it. I really wanted to get involved in a campaign. So I looked up, and there was this campaign, the Fossil Free Strathclyde, it was called at this time, that had just started a month before I arrived. So I joined in from the very beginning, and so the people that had started this campaign had previously run the Glasgow University divestment campaign, and so the University of Glasgow was the first university to divest in Europe. And so they got a win from that, and obviously this win brought a lot of enthusiasm to their group, and they decided to take on a bigger target, which is the Glasgow City Pension Fund. The pension fund run by the Glasgow City Council. It's wider than the Glasgow region, but they so. The first step of the campaigns were trying to find information about this pension fund and how much money do they invest in fossil fuel, who is actually running it. And so at this time it was more like, or for ourselves, trying to map out the power structure of who is running this institution. And so at this time we figured out that £800 million from this pension fund were invested in fossil fuel, which made it the second largest pension fund in the UK. So we understood that we were one of the big players in the divestment movement in the UK. That if a pension such as big as that of Glasgow would divest, then it would change the whole game for all the pension funds in the UK. So that made it a very exciting campaign to be part of. Because we could see that we could actually change things there, and it wasn't really about convincing people to take shorter showers and switch their lights off. It was really about tackling the power of the fossil fuel industry and of how it holds a grip over the whole of our public institutions. Before that, I was in France, and I had come across the concept of that divestment when The Guardian launched their own divestment campaign to convince the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust to divest. It's a campaign that had been running for over a year, and they did a podcast series as part of that. And by coming up on to the UK, I was actively seeking for a fossil-free group because of that. So I felt that it was really important that the people that were part of the divestment movement spread the word, because then it meant that other people like me and maybe others have joined along these groups.
Yeah, and a few others here did join. Does anyone want to go next.
My story's really embarrassing. I have to tell it now.
I guess.
Yeah. So I met my boyfriend on Tinder, and it turned out he was a huge climate activist. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I should have guessed on like our second day he was talking about feminism.
First day.
day?
Well, first day we were talking about climate change and pension fund.
I was like, this is the guy for me. So I mean, like, so I had zero experience. I was kind of just reading books about climate change and being really freaked out about the level of I don't know how deep in we were, and how I kind of naively thought like the state and government were dealing with it, and I was like, that's the scientist's job, that's not my problem. And I was like, oh no, this is my problem, this is really my problem and everybody's. So I went along to the first like the kind of relaunch of Fossil Free Strathclyde at the time, now Fossil Free Glasgow, and there were 4 of us, and to be honest, for the first like 4 weeks I had no idea what divestment was. I was like, but I was interested in like contributing, and it wasn't like I wasn't there because Matthew was running it. I was there because I genuinely had deep concern, and in that period of working with this group I got more involved with other groups like Young Friends Leader Scotland, and started to see how I could contribute, and actually how powerful I was just as a person in a group and trying to change things. Yeah, that's kind of how it started. I think the rest of it's everybody else's journeys as well.
So for me, I think it's probably a bit more straightforward. Just probably sheer moral like desperation over like this year.
More straightforward.
Yeah. Just this really realisation that if things carry on, we are essentially not in a good way, and I felt it was like, you know, a moral responsibility to do something about it. So I've been actively partaking in lots of groups to do with lots of kind of political issues, and I've probably been politicised about the Indie reference, the independence referendum that is, and it's all been part of my progress since then. But yeah, I think I remember Fossil Free Glasgow, Matthew did a talk in Glasgow University, and then he did a plant walk about a week later, and I said to myself, make sure you come and speak to that guy as part of Fossil Free Glasgow.
What's a
after
plant
the
walk?
It's like a sort of foraging walk, so you go through, it was in Pollock Country Park, just going through and eating all the sort of wild edible plants and leaves and fruits and mushrooms and all that. So after I spoke to him, I came along, and I've kind of stuck around since. It's been a great group of people. I mean, I must admit I was quite sceptical about divestment, and to a certain extent I still am, because I feel you spend a lot of time just talking to kind of political and social elites who are the people who are kind of complicit in the problem, and I don't really feel comfortable all the time dealing with them. But the people that I've met throughout the campaign have been like absolutely terrific, and a great basis for me as a campaigner and as a human being too.
Yeah. Because I was also lured in by a presentation that Matthew and Jenny did, Friends of the Earth Scotland divestment training, and I went along and I was involved in a few projects that had like a really big focus on like personal responsibility and making sure you're recycling properly and all these kind of like things that we're kind of told are the answer. And Jenny did a whole bit of maths about the carbon budget, and I was just like, wow, this is so bad. So they said, yeah, we meet every Monday. So I went along, and yeah, like straight away the way that like all the meetings are conducted and the way people treat each other and the kind of ambition within the group has been really nice, and for me like a kind of sense of community within it. Like I'd always had these kind of ideas and kind of values, but not necessarily translated them into anything kind of tangible, but having that community has been like such a supportive resource for that. I think you were also at the same training.
Yeah, I went to the same training. I think I sort of went along kind of by speech of serendipity. I'd moved to Glasgow fairly recently before that, or no, sometime before that. I hadn't really been living here much, but I was kind of looking for things to get involved with a bit, and that just came up on my Everbright or whatever it was, I think it was. Yeah, so I went along, and then I witnessed the same talk, and I think I just went over and I think talked to you, either Matthew or Yenny, and that was, I thought, well, I wanted to get involved in something down in Glasgow. This ticked a few boxes, and I just came along, and I think I don't know what my initial thought of the actual strategy was, but I thought the people involved seemed to have some sort of direction, some sort of clear aim, and I think also I kind of in some ways, although I agree with Scott about engaging with those elites in some ways as a sole strategy, I thought it was also quite good to go to people who had that sort of position and challenge them, and I think there needs to be a focus on both sides. So like before this I had been involved in like a kind of a more quite a local kind of campaign up where I'm from in the north of Scotland called Not Cool. That's around the kind of golf course up there, and before that I'd kind of got involved in some political stuff, a bit with the Green Party and things like that, but I was more like support politics, a bit more like civics like stuff, do it through my work, do it through my lifestyle, but I think this kind of outlet also kind of taps into my kind of more maybe radical edge as well. Like I'm definitely not kind of sitting in just the sustainability kind of sort of slightly improve on the way things are. It's pretty much transformation for me. So
yeah, I kind of I'd always been interested in environmental stuff, but again I was quite sort of individualistic with it, really like into recycling and not using straws, and then when I was studying at uni kind of realised that it was like much larger problem and we shouldn't necessarily be tackling it with like individual guilt, but I didn't actually get involved in the campaign until Zsara convinced me and Zsara have been friends for a long time, convinced me to go to a Young Friends of the Earth Scotland Skillshare weekend, and I went along to that, and I just really, well, first of all I just loved the culture, the way that people listen and the sort of tools that you use to make sure that marginalised voices are heard and to make sure that everybody gets their opinion, and really enjoyed that culture around that. But then also they did a workshop on the divestment campaign, and it was UK wide. They talked about how Edinburgh had been successful and how Glasgow University had been successful, and I just got really interested in how divestment as a cause could be a better way to do these things. So, and then I started coming along.
It's quite funny because after the Skillshare, Matthew said, "How did you convince Lisa to come along?" I was like, "I didn't convince her, told her," and then she was like, "Yes, I'm in."
Yeah, I did say you convinced me. You didn't really, you just invited me. I was like, "Sure, yeah, I'll come to that."
Yeah. I suppose my story is quite similar to that as well, in that Scott convinced me, and getting to know Zsara and Louise kind of convinced me as well that this is something I really want to be involved with. So I did have some background in, I suppose, a part of the environmental movement, but whether it was really climate activism, I'm not sure. It was because I was involved in the anti-fracking campaign in Scotland. So I came to find out about anti-fracking one day because I had a day off uni and I wasn't working, and at that time, and I was just there's this documentary channel on the telly which I became obsessed with, and there's a documentary called Gasland. So I sat and watched this all through, and it was just the effects that this industry was having on people. It was absolutely terrible, and it seemed to be completely going ahead without any sort of democratic input. Like people weren't getting to vote on it, people's rights weren't really being considered, and it was affecting like the real basis of their survival, so like their water, the air around them, and it was just like this very dramatic example of how undemocratic our system is and how extractive and how exploitative the industries are. So I'd thought about the fossil fuel industry in the abstract, but this really was like a concrete example that it needs these sort of zones, these sacrifice zones, which are going to be polluted, which are going to be is the only way that they can maintain their profits, and that's really what's important to the fossil fuel industry. So that's got me really concerned. And then by the end of that documentary, they mentioned that licenses were already being sold in Europe. And I went onto like a Scottish government website and I found out there was licenses like where I stayed and just next to that as well. So like around like the north of Glasgow or in Kirkintilloch and around Falkirk, there was already licenses sold at this point. But that seemed to have gone ahead without any sort of debate, without any media attention, or without any politician ever having talked about this. It wasn't something that was on the agenda, but it just had happened because the UK government coal authority had sold off these petroleum exploration licenses, and there didn't have to be a debate at that point. And it became more of a political issue in the coming years, and people became very aware of the situation in the United States. There was really dramatic images coming out of like Pennsylvania in particular of people's water and being able to be lit on fire because of the gas like coming through the groundwater. So like that was I think there's a lot of things about the system which I'd always disliked. A lot of things about numerous systems really, not just capitalism, but all of the systems that it relates to, like I suppose like patriarchy and white supremacy and things like that. And I think like fracking was just a really good example of how little power that people are really given, and how scary like things can actually get. So that got me mobilised, and for like since 2015 I've been quite involved. At the end of 2015 someone in the town I grew up in started an anti-fracking group, and I got really involved in that, and would go along to like national meetings as well as part of the Broad Alliance, which was a sort of collective of all of the local groups throughout Scotland who wanted to come together to work on the Scottish Government's consultation on fracking. So I was really involved in that for a while, and I was a delegate who would go along to the larger meetings. But since the ban was announced in Scotland, which isn't really a full ban because the licenses are still they're still here. They've not been revoked really, but there's been a bit of burnout, I suppose. So the people who led that group aren't as active right now, and I found myself like a little bit kind of wanting to do more climate stuff. I'm really involved in other forms of activism, like I'm really involved in like migrant solidarity and things like that. But I was like, I am completely neglecting the climate right now. And then so like when Scott offered me to come to this meeting, I was just super excited and getting more involved in tackling the system, because I think that's like what we have to do. And I've been really inspired by some of the actions that you guys have been involved in as well. I've been like aware of the work of like the group for ages, because like I think you introduced me to lots of terms like divestment and the carbon bubble just from picking up like your literature and stuff like that at conventions and conferences. And I think there was like a Naomi Klein screening like of This Changes Everything, and I picked up loads of literature from you guys after that as well. So it's been really super informative for me. But I think finding a community and finding a group of people who kind of see right through a lot of the debate around this and how it's not really where it needs to be given the seriousness of the situation.
It's interesting you said about the lack of knowledge surrounding a lot of these decisions, because I had no idea what pension fund was and how it worked, and I don't think a lot of people who have a pension or are paying into a pension fund have any idea the kind of investment. So we're obviously focused on fossil fuels, but things like tobacco and arms and all sorts of things that like generally people aren't keen to be associated with, but it's all sort of done in a way that people aren't aware that that's where their kind of future is resting on.
I mean, before I came here, my intellectual understanding of a pension fund was something you just paid money into, and somehow it got given to you when you retired. I had no idea the between part. Not even got invested anywhere. Like that was almost kind of alien to me. It makes perfect sense now that you think about it.
Yeah.
But at the time, like I just.
And for me as like a young person in 2018, even like thinking of having a pension just seemed unrealistic. Like when I saw like the WASPy campaigns about like government inequality for women and pension funds, I was just like, oh yeah, by the time I'm in my 60s, I'm not going to get a pension. So this is why it's even more infuriating, is because I'm probably not going to get a pension. Like realistically, if we look at our financial situation right now, it's not going to happen. But also the older generations get to benefit from the destruction of my future. it is something really unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, I had been sort of aware over some time of the sort of size that a lot of, these kind of pension funds are, and just like in some ways being slightly predatory. Like in some ways, like there's foreign pension funds investing in the sort of, companies which are buying up public services in other countries and stuff like that. And there is this kind of really interesting dynamic about these funds which are supposed to provide for people's future who knows how far in advance they're going to exist, right? I mean, because of the way the world's going, but really having a very problematic relationship with the next generation's future in some ways, and even the present, right?
Yeah, because one of the things from the divestment training, I was like, okay, so there's an economic argument against divestment, there's an environmental argument against it, and there's like an ethical argument against it. Like, why is this still happening? And yeah, the presentation just like spelled all that out, and I was just like, wow, this is incredible.
Yeah, and one thing that's important to remember is that pension funds are required by law to invest in what will give them the best return. So if there's a war and it makes economic sense to invest in weapons, then they are required by law to invest in that weaponry. And that is the case for fossil fuel at the moment, where our whole economy is reliant on the exploitation of fossil fuels. And because of that fact, then it makes sense for them to invest in it, because it gives them a lot of return at the end of the fiscal year. But we have been trying to convince convince them that this is only a short-term vision, and that we cannot, in the long term, continue to invest in something that we know to be destructive and therefore unprofitable.
Could you expand on who them is?
Well, is them is the people in charge of the pension fund. So that means the public servants that have been given the task to manage that pension fund, but also the Glasgow City Councillors that then take the political decision that's over the investment of that pension fund. But so far, the Glasgow City Councillors have decided to outsource their responsibility to those public servants that then managed it.
Yeah, because when I joined the campaign, I naively thought that once you just pass this information on, the economic argument, environmental argument, ethical argument, then things would change. But there's actually been a lot of engagement with these decision makers. Does anyone want to speak to what that experience has been like?
So I've had, one of our tactics is called lobbying. So that's where you go to councillors' surgeries and present your argument of divestment, or whatever you feel important. Us, it's divestment. And me and Yenny, another campaigner, decided we were going to speak to Jennifer Leydon. We kind of did a bit of research. We felt that actually she was quite sympathetic to a lot of similar causes. Like, she's been quite vocal in about feminism, very supportive of local communities, and we thought this just makes sense. Like, this just makes sense that she will understand that our pension funds that she has power in changing shouldn't be invested in fossil fuels and arms. But for us, we were going in about fossil fuels. And we really were very well prepared. We did like a pitch when we arrived in, and I was just struck by like the lack of ability for her to make any comment. Like, she just couldn't say whether she could agree with divestment or not. Like, even on a human level, it wasn't like that conversation. It wasn't normal. It was like, oh yes, well, we'll have to check. Who are you checking with? And we'll have to check with like the investment managers. And I'm like, yeah, but you're my elected representative. Why can't you tell me now that this is a problem that you would like to work on? And from that, we kind of left like very shaken up, thinking, wow, this is a bigger issue than just the fact that they're investing in fossil fuels. I feel like there's a issue generally about democracy here. And as the campaign moved forward, as we lobbied with more councillors, there was one councillor, I can't remember who it was, Cahill, that you met with.
Yeah, we met with the current, I think he was the current chair of the committee, and he seemed to understand, I mean, to some degree, the issue, but his stance seemed to be that, I think one that, I think if we were just coming as a small group, that wasn't going to be able to exert much pressure on the actual committee. Even though he said, the idea is that the councillors don't really respond to public pressure on this issue, I don't think that's true at all. I think the fact that we kind of weren't coming... I mean, this is an issue which they were aware doesn't really have much wider public understanding.
I mean, we've been disregarded as a student campaign.
Yeah.
Being
which isn't
so he was
factual.
he was very welcoming to us when he thought we were just sort of member of his local community coming up with some issue about, I don't know, the canals or something like that. And then as soon as he kind of cottoned on that we were kind of maybe a pressure group or something like that, he completely changed his kind of... he changed his faces a few times during the actual conversation.
Yeah, because I think some of the kind of ideas, the kind of suggestions we were getting were they had to ask the men who knew about money, which was kind of the answer we got a lot. Do you want to speak to that?
Oh, well, yeah, I had that big time with one of the councillors, Philip Bratt, who was the previous chair of the council. Obviously, there was the local elections in 2017, right? Where the Labour Council, which was in power for 50 years, is now no longer in power. Now the SNP Council is in power. So Philip Bratt, Labour councillor, no longer runs the Pension Fund Committee. And yeah, just trying to engage with them. I tried to arrange a meeting with them, wasn't interested. I tried to pressure him to actually arrange a meet, to actually probably commit to arranging a meeting. He tried to get me to have a meeting with the pension fund managers, i.e. the public servants who are in charge of the pension fund.
I.e. the men who know about money.
Exactly, the men who know about money. I can't remember what happened in between then, but we ended up in a situation where I think we tried to get a meeting as a group with Philip Bratt, the pension fund, or the men who know about money, and some of the other councillors, and that was just flat out blocked by the pension fund manager, i.e. the man who knows about money. We were very much...
Is he able to do that? Should he be able to do that?
I guess, should he? Probably not, no, because ultimately he's part of a public body, and this is a real concern that we are sort of bringing forth. Is he able to do it within the law? I actually don't know, and I suspect probably not. I don't think there's probably a hard and fast law about it, but I think what he's doing is improper. But yeah, it was just a labyrinth, and to me it was kind of stunk of a very sort of cynical approach to the public from them. So you go speak to the councils, they say, okay, go speak to those people and those people over there, not our problem. You speak to those people they tell you to speak to, they say go speak to those people and those other people over there, and they just send you down a rat race, and ultimately they just waste your time. I mean, it was interesting because that was my first time, so I think I said before, I had some cynicism towards people with power, but I'd never really experimented with it, and that was almost like a sort of experiment to see how these people respond when you sort of press them, and it turns out they kind of respond just as I suspected.
Because the idea behind the group meeting was we'd been contacting councillors separately, and to sort of make the best use of everyone's time, if we can get everyone together and have a group discussion about it, that might have been quite fruitful.
Yeah, I think as well because there was the new councillors in place, and when Louise and Jenny spoke to Jennifer Lady, it was quite apparent that she didn't know anything about divestment or the relationship between fossil fuels and the pension fund. So this was a chance for us, believe it or not, to educate people on the sort of pension fund committee about fossil fuels and the principles of divestment.
Something I find particularly difficult with it is just the not wanting to hear. Like, so we can go in there with our pitches and our facts and information and think that that rationalisation will change their mind. But I've felt in those interactions that they're just closed to it. It's too complicated, it's too big an issue, and they just don't want to be challenged like that, or take the risk, like the political risk that's required of them to make those changes.
When I went to meet the chair of the committee, I felt like it was more also just coming from a different kind of perspective, in that, you know, what he saw as a priority was different from what. So he made all sorts of rationale, but it was like basically, you know, we're beholden to maximising this, how much money we're making. Basically, right now, this is seen as a safer investment, and we could look at changing it, but it would be a process of doing a proper analysis. And if you can bring us the figures, we'll do it. If you haven't got the figures, then come back one day with them or something like that, because we're not necessarily going to do it.
Yeah, one of the responses that we've had is that this is not an ethical decision. They shouldn't be like, they're not allowed to make the decision based on ethics. It has to just be purely on financial gains, which first of all is just totally out of whack. Like saying that to start with, those words to have come out of someone's mouth, well, I think it was in an email, but someone still typed them and thought that they were rational, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, that plus the whole, if you can do this research for me, it's like, that's not my job. But like, we have to like come up with all of these facts and figures.
Yeah. Which is even more ridiculous when you realise that like the fossil free movement is a global movement, and there are like huge notable divestments like very recently. So even that kind of like New York, and like even that kind of pressure isn't enough. Even those good examples.
Well, they just said it's a different context. Like each place is different. Each place has to make it based on what is rational for the application. But it's like the investments are global, so it's not. You know, I mean, the investments are not geographically located. So
I mean, just something I'm getting like when we talk about this, it's almost like the way they talk about it, they don't actually realise like the consequences of like fossil fuels, right? So this is like, I mean, I'm not even being melodramatic when I say this is like life and death stuff. We're talking about fossil fuels is going to be the end of us all. And it's just a little sort of complete utter disconnect.
It feels like they definitely think that we're a bit silly, and you're like, climate chaos. Like, people have already lost their homes. Like, why are we not taking this seriously? And that is just total Western white privilege of us as people driving around in their big cars, like unaffected by the snow.
What was your kind of example of it?
It was when we had the beast from the east, and I'm like traipsing through like 2 feet of snow to get to Tesco, like all like bundled up like a marshmallow, and then people were just driving past in their 4x4s, and I was like, all year round I've been wondering why people would need a 4x4 in Glasgow, and now it turns out it's so that they can get around in the snow.
I suppose for some people it's just like, you know, you can just, in some ways you can almost imagine the power of personal experience. Like if that person had been, say, over in Indonesia during Hurricane Haiyan, and they're you can, you know, that seems to I mean, obviously that has a huge effect on some people. For some people, they can go from, you know, one day to, and I think that's the case with some people, that because in some ways they're not personally affected, maybe their family isn't, and they're also in a job which kind of has this kind of black box mentality, they can just maintain that kind of confidence and something which doesn't square with the wider world kind of.
Yeah, I would like, that's kind of, I think that's also where a lot of us have come from. Like maybe not in my 4x4, but I definitely like, I played into the culture of flying all the time. Like I really like that millennial style, like I need to travel to see the world, and that's how I'll grow. And like what took me was having conversations and reading and understanding that, and I think we should I've kind of lost my point now, but it's like we should afford other people that and expect it of them as well. I don't think it's a good enough excuse to not be personally affected by climate change to change.
Yeah, because like what's coming up here is that like we're all pretty passionate and pretty emotional about it, and I think sometimes like that's been used as a way to kind of devalue our argument that it's an emotional argument. But we've engaged with these decision makers for like quite a period of time, and if we all want to make like a sound for how that's made us feel, just like just like we've got all this like energy and all this like enthusiasm to try and make tangible changes, and this is what we're dealing with, which is why we're here doing this podcast, because we're pivoting. Like, we really believe in like the cause, but our previous strategies have just drained us all, I think.
It's so I read a book called The Art of Protest, which was like kind of changed my thinking on how to do activism, and it was like, if your first strategy doesn't work, change it. If it works, change it. Like, you should always be reinventing how you do activism and how you engage in protest. And for me, I've become really frustrated by like the climate and environmental movement in Scotland, because it's NGO led. Like, if we look at the big NGOs like Stop Climate Chaos, Friends of the Earth, Keep Scotland Beautiful, places like that, Climate 2050, they have their own agendas, and they're also they have their own style of activism, and it's not actually reactive to the situation we're in. So by creating this podcast, it was by trying to use another tool, another method of making people aware of the fact that this injustice is happening in their own city, but also to inspire other activists to think outside of the box about how we want to do activism. And something about podcasts in this group was that it spoke to a lot of us. Like, a lot of us are very passionate about podcasts. That's how we do a lot of learning, because it's free and it's democratic and it gives voice to a lot of people that don't often get a voice. So that's why we've chosen this tool.
And also the theory of change that we stand for by doing a podcast is different than the one that we were going for before. Before, it was still appealing to the people in power. We're thinking that if we convince the people in power to do the rational thing, then the world will align into stopping climate chaos. But by realizing that this is a flawed assumption in the first place, then we have to change the way that we do activism, and by doing something that is more about public education, spreading the word out. We don't expect that the manager of the Strathclyde Pension Fund will listen to the podcast and will think, oh yeah, they are right, I will change my investment decisions from now on. No, with this we want to spread the word out to other people that will be willing to actually take part in activism in other forms. Even if they don't engage with the divestment movement, they will do things in their lives that will all lead to the same place. And so we want to put all our bets on people, the power of people, rather than institutions being changed.
And I think there's a lot to say for even just our energy right now doing this, as opposed to when we read out emails that we get back from councillors, you know. So that's what's gonna like give us that sustainability in our own campaign, is feeling empowered through what we're doing.
Just wanted to come back on a point that Louise made there really nicely about sort of connection and people maybe not feeling affected by climate change at the moment. I mean, I feel like this level of consciousness I have about these issues right now, I do feel affected, obviously not in the way that some people are, where they've actually lost their homes and maybe lost people, or they've had to make migrations due to climate change. But like with the summer that we had like this year, like with the sort of heat and like drought conditions, like just thinking about like how like you're watering your houseplants like twice a day and things like that, and like that's causing like a serious like panic among me and some of my friends who really are interested in climate issues. But then there's certain people who, if you say that to, it sounds a bit like out there, I suppose, to say that this is because of climate change that we're having such dramatic fluctuations in weather. But I also like was at a documentary film screening last night, and some of the migration the communities I'm involved with, and it was called Tasting Freedom, and it was about the UK detention centres and detention estate within 1994. And one of the really powerful scenes from this was, and there's a lot of really sad things you could say about this, because in a lot of ways things haven't changed that much, or they've got worse in a lot of ways, but one of the most powerful scenes was a scene of like just total solidarity between people who are in the community where this detention centre was based and people who were inside the detention centre, and they were like people outside the detention centre were protesting it being open, and were talking to the people within the detention centre through the gates, and everybody started to sing about wanting freedom. And you could actually it was a really well shot documentary as well, so you could actually feel like the gates starting to shake and like this big system feeling like it was going to start to crumble because of the weight of this human connection and solidarity. And I think that is like something that's been like, I've been thinking about that a lot because I just watched this film yesterday, but I think we could maybe reach out to other communities which have been affected by climate issues and try to show solidarity and support, and maybe like those real human stories and connections as well is what people are good at. It's like we're all storytellers like naturally, I suppose, and maybe that's what's going to help bridge that sort of consciousness difference, because I think that's what did it for me. It was the stories of people in Pennsylvania which got me into anti-fracking activism, which eventually got me into knowing more about climate change. So
yeah, I think we're all really aware of how like all these different systems of oppression overlap, and that we are focused on getting the Strathclyde pension fund to divest from fossil fuels. Like, we realise that is part of a huge system, and there's lots of different kind of topics within that we'd like to go on to explore and to see how we can use that to kind of shape our way forward. Does anyone want to speak to some of those topics? The kind of things that we've got excitement and energy and curiosity about talking more about?
Well, like, I suppose for me it's just, I mean, on one hand I'm quite excited that this podcast is going to be a platform for which we can kind of, maybe approach other people who've been, involved in other different but related campaigns, and, maybe on one level interview them and kind of understand their kind of what they're involved in, their perspective, but through that also maybe gain some sort of connection and kind of broaden our kind of sort of engagement and profile within the community. And also, like, for me, I suppose the topic of just the fact that I think one issue I often have with sort of climate change itself being the big thing is that it's kind of like, it's almost sometimes produced this monster which humans input into and just kind of gone out of control, whereas I see it as like sort of a subset of what I'd call like the ecological crisis, which I think has already in some ways had much bigger impact than climate change, in terms of, like, I don't know if there's still yet one species which has been, I think there might be one or two which have definitively shown climate change has caused extinction in, but there's literally thousands which direct human. And I think for me part of it is also like bringing those two stories together, but also there being a much more integrated perspective on, say, human direct impact on the land use, which I think isn't considered like in a coherent way. It's like all these different things are happening, whereas I think of that as quite a coherent thing. Like, in general, humans are increasing their direct impact on ecosystems still, but it's not seen in a coherent way.
I'm really excited for not just one particular topic, but speaking to the breadth of people that are working in the environmental, climate, social justice movements in Scotland, because when you're an activist here it can sometimes feel quite lonely, and when you're meeting, I love our group, we meet every week, and like I feel real connection with that, but outside of this group sometimes it feels like you're the only person working on this, and I know it's not true, and I really can't wait for this podcast to be like a recorded evidence that there's lots of people like me and you here that care enough to do something with their lives to change.
One thing that really excites me is to take the fossil free movement a step further, because so far fossil free has been equated with divestment, and but I think that the whole strategy of divestment itself is obsolete now, because even if money were to move away from fossil free industry into clean investments, the whole financial system as a whole is still reliant on the fossil fuel economy, and it would collapse without it. So and if it collapses, then all of these systems which rely on it would not be able to fulfill their function. So it's important that we find a way to transition a whole society away from fossil fuels, and so exploring that way and to try to find new narratives of what a society without fossil fuel would look like, and what are the strategies that we have to get involved in order to move towards that state.
Can you give some examples of those strategies?
Well, strategies. There have been massive actions of disobedience against fossil fuel extractions, for instance, where people have risked their lives to prevent the fossil fuel industry from extracting resources that were under their backyard. Like you were talking, Dan, before about the fracking, anti-fracking movement, and that is one of the case. The other side are the people that are already trying to create the world of tomorrow, creating the structures that allow them to have a comfortable life without depending on a society that provides them the food at their supermarket and all of these chains. If you see of how by living in a city you are already by definition reliant on the fossil fuel industry, because your food is produced by having an input of fertilizer that are based on a byproduct from gas extraction, and then this food is then transported using fossil fuel to a supermarket that uses fossil fuel to cool that thing so that you're able to buy it. So we completely need to recreate those systems. Otherwise, if we try to transition away from fossil fuel while having people being dependent on that, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
I think this is a topic that we're all pretty passionate about, and we're all like working on kind of different projects on how that would look and how that would be, and like gaining new skills. Does anyone want to speak about the new skills within that?
I've definitely taken a lot of new skills over the last wee while. I actually quit my job in a place of glory. Actually, that's a bit melodramatic. It was a pretty mundane leave my job thing. Just started a new job now, but it meant I had 2 or 3 months with which to learn new skills. So I've been learning how to ferment foods, which is kind of, to put it simply, putting it in a jar and leaving it for ages. So anyone can do it. Even just things like making my own bread, going out foraging, finding wild plants to eat and stuff. These are sort of small things, but they're little kind of vestiges of like the alternative, and they allow you to sort of connect with people and share things, and that is kind of in and of itself probably a chance for community building, which could be part of the new system. I should say, like, a lot of that's come from the people around this table. Like, they've been a big inspiration for like me learning all these things.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting point, because that's one of the biggest achievements of this campaign, is not necessarily the fact that we've convinced the decision maker to change their mind, because we haven't managed that, but it's the fact that by engaging with these campaigns we have learned so many seemingly unrelated things, but that have really empowered us and helped us to actually create this new society that we're hoping to see.
By making a podcast.
Yeah, I think, like, just to further on that, it's created a community. Like, it's created a community of people that are helping each other transition out of a capitalist, fossil fuel dependent society and into something new and fulfilling and renewing for the planet rather than destructive. And I, like, having stepped in the door that first day for the Divestment campaign, thinking, what the hell is this, and seeing where I am now, it's been life-changing, and it's only been a year. So having a podcast that might help people make those changes and create a more fulfilling life is pretty powerful.
I definitely think that, like, one of the great things about the podcast is that we've been having these really excited discussions about all the things that we're passionate about anyway, so the idea of just recording them, and maybe other people might find that interesting, or at least feel a little bit less isolated around that, is really nice. I like that idea.
Thanks for listening. You can follow our campaign on Twitter at @FF_Glasgow. We're also on Facebook, Fossil Free Glasgow, where you can get in touch with us and sign our petition.